So when I was a little boy, I went shopping with my mother and my sister. And I got bored really quickly and I hid in one of those circular clothing racks. And I hid so well that my mother and my sister thought they had lost me somewhere in the department store, and they began to panic. And just before they put out an APB to try to find me, I jumped out of the clothing rack and said, "Here I am." Yeah, that didn't go over too well with Mom. She wanted to kill me. I had taken her to a place where she didn't want to go. A place where she had lost her son. And my mother's quite a devout woman, and she really believed that God had given her a son late in life. She had waited 16 years before she had me after having her first child. So I sort of sprung up on her and said, "Here I am, another time." But it was also at a time when women generally didn't have children that late in life. And so despite those odds, here I am anyway. And yet there have been many times in my life when I didn't want to say, "Here I am." There were plenty of times in my life when I did a pretty good job of hiding. Like when I stayed in an unsatisfying career for 10 years instead of moving into something that would be more life-giving. I dated women who were all wrong for me and stayed in those relationships way too long. And I avoided my family because it was just too hard to watch my mother suffer with illness and depression sometimes. But there have been times in my life when I did say, "Here I am." And you want to know what I learned during those times? I learned that those are the times of my life that I now find most precious, most endearing. And more importantly, they're the times in my life that I had the most profound experiences of God working in my life. Like when I went on service immersion trips to El Salvador and Nicaragua. When I committed to lifelong marriage to someone who was truly in love with me. When I went to the bedside of a dying college roommate. When I did take those first 2 steps to a new career. When I actually dealt with the feelings around my mother's illness. When I had difficult but healing conversations. And frankly, when I became the director of campus ministry, where tough and sometimes unpopular decisions would fall to me. In each of those examples, I initially did not want to say, "Here I am." I wanted to say, "I'll be over there hiding in the clothing rack." I needed courage from God to help me enter into these situations, to be able to say, "Here I am." And when I prayed during those times, I often thought of Abraham, a simple man who just trusted that God knew what he was doing. Because can you imagine the initial fear Abraham must have had when God asked him to do the unthinkable, to murder his own son? A son he had waited years for. A son that he and his wife conceived in their old age. But Abraham knows something that we've probably forgotten about this story. Abraham remembers that God gave him Isaac in the first place. And more importantly, God made him a promise regarding Isaac. He said that Isaac would be the one who would provide him with descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands of the seashore. And so Abraham trusts that God will be faithful to his promise to him. And so he thinks that God must have something up his sleeve if he asks him to do this. And so Abraham said, "Here I am." And off he went to begin to carry out what God had asked him to do. And what is God's response to all of this? God's astonished. God can't believe that Abraham would do this. "Do not lay a hand on this boy. Are you crazy? I know now how faithful you are." And that changes everything. God becomes even more faithful to Abraham than he could have imagined because of that "Here I am." And his descendants do become as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the seashore. Abraham becomes much more than just the father to Isaac. Just as God had promised, Abraham becomes the father of many more. And we tell this story because God is hoping that we will be inspired to say, "Here I am," too. That we might be willing to go to the places that God calls us to in our lives, to perhaps give our lives over to others, even when that seems scary. That we can have the faith that God will be faithful to us, even when we don't know how things are always going to turn out. And too often we're afraid. Afraid to not have all those answers. Afraid, frankly, to be afraid. But when we're afraid, that's a good sign that God is working on something wonderful, more wonderful than we could imagine, and is constantly calling us into a deeper relationship, not only with God, but with others in our lives as well. And that's what Lent's all about. Lent is about burning our fear to ignite what challenges us. And when we work through those fears, we find that we are stronger than we ever hoped we could be. We discover a deeper, stronger, a more satisfying life. And that's also in our gospel tonight. The disciples see this transfigured image of Jesus, dazzling white, and he too says to them, "Here I am." But they're afraid. And they're afraid not because this is some kind of spooky image, but they're afraid because the transfiguration is a vision not only of what a resurrected Jesus looks like, but it's also a foretaste of what will happen to us. For God also promises that we too will rise. And that's a hard thing for people to buy, including these disciples, because they know that it will be difficult for them to become all that God hopes they can be. Well, let's face it, these guys are not the smartest, they're not the bravest, and many times neither are we. And because of that, God gathers us here each week and says to us at this altar, "Here I am," with a piece of bread and a cup of wine, transformed by God, stretching forth from this altar to us, so that we might have the courage to believe that God will always be there for us, no matter what life throws at us. Tonight, God says to each one of us, "Here I am." Might we this Lent dare to say the same? So if you've made no Lenten resolutions thus far, there's no time like the present. Here are just a few small but profound ways that you might try this out. If there's that roommate you need to patch things up with, say, "Here I am." That person who maybe treated you unkindly, say, "Here I am." Is there a professor that drives you berserk? Stay in a relationship. Say, "Here I am." The lonely, the neglected, someone you've just been too busy for, say, "Here I am." And in these cold winter months, remember that there are some who have no place to call home. And maybe just once before the end of the semester, you can join us on Sunday afternoon and offer them some coffee or a sandwich with our sandwich ministry. And when you do that, through you, God says, "Here I am." And when you look at those that you serve, you see the face of Jesus looking back at you, saying, "Here I am in return." What do you want to burn away this Lent? Burn away that hiding place, and trust that God will give you the courage to face your fears and to enter into a deeper and more vibrant experience of life. So pray with me tonight by saying just 4 simple words. Lord, here I am.